For years, I've always been fascinated, and I've always, as you guys know, talked about different treasure hunts around the globe. The Curse of Oak Island, in which Nate can't stand when I talk about it because he's like, they're never going to find anything. And then every once in a while, you find out about one that you've never heard of, which could possibly be the most real, most fascinating treasure that's quote-unquote never been found. And there's a new docuseries on Discovery Plus airing now, new episodes out weekly, Gold Lies in Videotape. Documenting the entire thing is Alex Alonso. Hello, Alex.
Hello.
And your partner is the grandson of the story, which we'll get to here in just a second, Terry Dolanas. How are you, Terry?
Hey, doing great.
So we've got to break this down before we can get into all these little questions that I have. Terry, I want you to go back to 1937 at the beginning of this whole entire story so my audience understands what we're dealing with and the magnitude of what we're dealing with. Please.
Okay, I'll give you the thumbnail. In 1937, my grandfather, Doc Noss, who was three-quarter Cheyenne Indian, and my grandmother, Babe Noss, were on a deer hunting trip in southern New Mexico, near where they lived, in Hot Springs, New Mexico. And they stumbled into a vertical entrance down a small hill that led them to a series of tunnels, chambers, passageways, and caverns. And over the weeks of exploration that followed their initial discovery in 1937, they started finding caverns full of conquistador artifacts, Aztec artifacts, stacks of metal bars, which turned out to be silver and gold bullion, and all kinds of materials from what seemed to be raids, possibly conducted by the Apache tribes in Arizona and New Mexico from around 1700 to 1880. So it was a conglomeration of treasure, artifacts, and other materials that had been stashed in the caves in this small mountain over a period of 200 to 700 years.
That's Victoria Peak we're talking about, correct?
That is correct. That is the current map name of the peak. The more ancient name of the mountain that they explored was Soledad Peak, and it became known as Victoria Peak in the 1800s because after the passing of Geronimo, Chief Victorio became the master chief of the Apache tribes, and Soledad Peak became his headquarters and camp.
And when you say your grandparents found all this treasure and you kind of just ran through the gold bars and the silver bars, we're talking about like 16,000 gold bars, correct?
That was in one room.
Yeah, exactly. So this isn't like, hey, look, we found a quarter. We found the treasure. Okay, so the treasure is there, and they can't by themselves remove it. So what happens afterwards? And then why are we here still finding the treasure if they already found it back then?
All perfectly logical questions. So the discovery was 1937. Since 1935, there was something called the Gold Act in place in the U.S., and it was during those years until 1975, in fact, it was illegal for American citizens to own gold in bullion form without turning it into the mint and people had to turn in not only their gold bullion, but their gold certificates, because America was going off the gold standard and onto the silver standard, and new currency would be issued in the form of silver certificates. So for this period of American history, you really were not supposed to have gold bullion. So it was sort of like finding a buried train car load of some illegal substance. If you can't convert it to cash, what good is it? So Doc got some attorneys, and he was advised to take some of the gold bullion bars to the Denver Mint and try to turn them in and convert them to cash. The Denver Mint just confiscated them and said, we'll give you a receipt that you turned them in, but we're not going to give you cash. You have to show us where you're getting the material. So Doc and Babe went back to the governor of New Mexico and asked his help and said, how are we going to legally claim this material and legally convert it to cash? And the governor advised them to make safe access into the mountain so state and federal and Treasury Department officials could go into the cave with them and see that it was not contraband gold, but actually gold treasure that they had found in place. So in the process of trying to make safe access into the treasure caverns, a cave-in was caused by trying to dynamite a terribly huge rock out of the passageway, and the upper passageway into the mountain was sealed in 1939.
Wow. So they couldn't get back there. And now where we're at today is there's a continuous struggle with you and your family name against the United States government, because the idea is that they went back and got it.
Yeah, the story quickly became more complicated because after the passage was blocked, Doc only had about 200 bars of gold outside the mountain that he and my grandmother had already removed. He was afraid to sell that. He didn't know how to convert that to cash. And at the same time, as World War II ramped up, they were testing the atomic bomb just 70 miles from Victoria Peak. So it was necessary for the federal testing range to extend their boundary, and they took Victoria Peak inside the federal missile range test boundary. Doc and Babe then had only intermittent access to the peak and could only partially remove the rubble that was blocking their entrance back into the treasure cave. Finally, the federal installation became White Sands Missile Range, and they took the land permanently and denied access to my grandparents. In a last-ditch effort to raise capital to get legal help and equipment to help salvage the treasure, my grandfather tried to sell 51 of the gold bars to a guy in Texas who murdered him in the middle of the transaction.
That's Charlie Ryan.
That's Charlie Ryan.
Was he ever convicted of murdering your grandfather?
He was tried, but not convicted of murder because of some irregularities in the trial, which are addressed in the Gold, Lies, and Videotape program. He was acquitted on the grounds of self-defense for shooting in cold blood an unarmed man who was running away from him.
Wow. And Alex, as a documentarian, you must be just struggling to find content for Gold, Lies, and Videotape. I mean, where would you find an interesting story to fill all these episodes? Jesus.
Well, I mean, when I dropped all the videotapes off to them, they were just about ready to throw up. They actually said they've never seen so much archival footage. In fact, it's possible, after talking to the showrunner, Paul Sadowski, he thinks he has enough for 3 seasons worth just with what we shot. And I've been shooting since 1987. And I collected the the original footage that Terry has been collecting for decades before that, which of course is audio tape and some film. But we're talking a lot of footage, and honestly, so far I've not seen the series. Even though I shot most of it, I've not seen it. I chose not to. I want to be the guy in the room with everybody else, and can't wait to see what's up next on the screen. They've done a fantastic job, because this is such a huge story, and I'll have it isn't just about the gold. It isn't just about the treasure hunt. It isn't just about the family. It's also about government. It's about conspiracy. Cloak and dagger. There's so much going on, and it keeps getting revealed back like an onion. They keep revealing the next steps to it. Meanwhile, documenting it as we go. So it's been an amazing journey. But I tell you, for me, it was relief. It was a relief to hand it to them, because my intention always was possibly to actually edit this beast myself. But frankly, it's a lot easier for me to sit here now and say somebody else, yeah, you guys do it. You got it. Great. So,
so I mean, with this story that dates back to 1937, I mean, this isn't your first rodeo, Alex. So have you just always been enamored with this story, and have you had a long relationship with Terry, or how did you guys meet?
Well, 1987, perhaps 86, I had a small production company in Irvine, California, and I just did industrial videos, and I saw this as an opportunity to make a documentary. And when, finally pitched it to Terry, he's like, yeah, that sounds like a great idea. Of course, I didn't stipulate when it would be released. If I told him it would have been released in 2023, he might have thought differently about it. But once I got involved, I really started, and that's part of the show, is like this morphing of me just shooting and being a fly on the wall to seeing things that perhaps weren't right, or experiencing things like I wanted to follow the route Doc took, but with video. And so I went down the 20 stories of the path he took, which is just absolutely treacherous. And I try to capture every bit of that. And I was 24 years old then, and completely bulletproof. And so I just would crawl and try to get as much footage I can. And I think we're seeing the results of that, certainly in the first 2 episodes. And this third one, of course, coming up this Friday at 9 p.m., at least here on the Pacific. So, I urge people to watch it, because what you're going to see, if this makes sense, is a kind of reality show that was shot in the 90s before there was such a thing. Mm-hmm. That wasn't my intention, of course. I didn't even know what that is. But what ends up happening is you end up watching the project increase in size and technology and the vastness for us to, we're triangulating to get to the main room. It's like this chase to get to the main room. And that's kind of what this is all about. And, but I'm going to, no spoilers, so you're going to have to watch.
Well, I can assume, I started out the conversation talking about like the Curse of Oak Island and stuff like that. And we've talked to the Laginas, and, I would assume, as, you, Terry, telling your story, and Alex, you as a documentarian, trying to tell the story visually and audibly, as a fan, as a viewer, we're all waiting for, season 5 is when they're going to find the treasure. They've got to find the treasure. Oak Island hasn't found the damn treasure in like 12 years. But it's the story that goes along with it. And your story is extremely fascinating. And I'm glad you said that, Alex, about, the conspiracy, because this is what happens. We've seen stories. I think there's a guy that's still in jail that refuses to tell where he found some treasure that was in a shipwreck, because he feels like it's his, and the government, for whatever country there wants it. So is that your ultimate goal, Terry, is just to tell the story and to say, hey, look, my family got screwed over. It's not about the gold. I'm fine. It's really just about calling people out.
Great question. Unfortunately, when the military of the 50s and 60s at that particular base extended their boundaries, they got a lot of pushback from the citizens who lost their ranches, farms, and mining sites. And the way they handled it with my grandparents' claim land and story was to begin a disinformation campaign. And some really ugly things were floated to the media about my grandparents. Oddly, that disinformation campaign has continued to this day. And when I decided that it was time to go to Victoria Peak, do a proper salvage, and do the proper archaeological survey that needed to begin documenting the history of the site, I wrote to the Secretary of the Army and basically said, I'm the grandson of Doc and Ovanos, and I'd like to talk to you about Victoria Peak. I was immediately granted a meeting with the Secretary of the Army. I then met with the Assistant Secretary of Defense. I met with several congressmen. Later on in the journey and earlier, I met with General Counsel for one of the presidents. Whistleblowers started showing up and telling us sections and pieces and parts of the story from different government agencies, and we started documenting, videotaping, recording, and trying to put those whistleblower stories into a puzzle piece picture and figure out what had really happened. So it's not just the chase of figuring out where the gold came from and if it's still in the peak. It's the chase of what happened to the portions of the treasure that were definitely removed, what agencies and politicians and government officials were involved in those removals, where did the material go? So that's part of the story that you'll see in future seasons of Victoria Peak. In the meantime, we're tracking down the location of some of the material that was removed from the peak, and we're preparing a petition to go back to Victoria Peak and hopefully salvage what we're quite confident remains in the mountain that has not been removed.
Wow. Alex, how difficult was it Terry just mentioned the whistleblowers, which I was curious about, after all these years, you would think that there's some people that are like, oh, I was there, I saw it with my own two eyes, and this is what happened. How difficult was it to find those people and get them to talk?
I would say most of the time they came to us,
Really?
or it's a process. It's a bouncing ball where one thing leads to another. There's a book writer out there that's written about these books and has done some investigative work, and he's gotten people, shaking the bushes, has gotten some leads. But once you have the lead, you still have a new problem. Is this guy nuts? That's literally should be on my T-shirt when I walk in. Are you nuts? Answer this question first before we move on. And in some cases, Terry and I have flown around the country because some of the stuff was really good, or driven. And then we go, and in one case in particular, we went to San Diego once, and it was 100% one of Doc's personal friends. He had an alias and a different name, and he probably had a darn good reason for it. But it was very clear that this was Doc's friend. And eventually he came out to Victoria Peak in his late 80s still and recognized Terry's aunt. They used to dance together and hang out back in the 30s and 40s. And that's where it's great. I mean, when you could start getting the old timers come out, and he is in the show as well and shows off some of the goodies he got from Doc Noss in the show. And that's all very real. I was there to videotape all that. So that's just one example, but the intrigue, the conspiracy part of it, oh, there's some good stuff coming. But, I had to vet these people personally. And I did that by saying, okay, you say you're at the Victoria Peak. Let's talk about that. Where is it? How did you get there? What's it look like? Where were you? And that's how I start vetting them, because they don't have a photograph to prove anything. They're just telling a story. And in most of the cases, we're finding that there's always a grain of truth in all of these stories. Nobody's going to go that far out of their way to make something up, especially if they're paying for their own plane ticket
Mm.
to go to one of our studios or whatever, you know, and that's part of the process. I get a studio rented out. We'd record their statements. And again, we're talking a lot of interviews, a lot of people on screen. And this story is really, really mostly about people. And that's what's great. It isn't thin. It isn't a thin, we're trying to chase down some, you know, some little brooch that's sitting in a field, you know, like some other shows. And we have some real meat on the bone when it comes to this story. You just got to tune in. I think you may leave saying this is the greatest story never told.
I believe you. I really, really do. That's why I was so excited to have both you gentlemen on the show. I just find this so fascinating. Terry, have you had any contact, or do we see in Gold Lies and Videotape, again, Discovery Plus, new episodes are out weekly, currently out weekly. Have you had any contact with the Ryan family and maybe the grandkids of the man that assassinated your grandfather, and gotten any valuable information from them?
I have not personally, but one of the authors who written some books about this has talked to the grandchildren of Charles Ryan, and turns out that his dastardly deed ruined his life as well. He died homeless guy with alcohol use disorder, and even his family wouldn't speak to him. He made a very poor decision when he pulled the trigger the second time and put that bullet in Doc's brain. He sealed himself off not only from benefiting from the gold or the wealth, but he sealed his fate for a really awful life. So, but they didn't have any clues or information about where some of the gold bullion was, but other people have brought us clues, like the gentleman who helped Doc move the bars from the airstrip the night before Doc was murdered, and where he put them. He has since gone back and retrieved some of those bars.
Wow.
And Alex not only interviewed him, he has gone on an expedition with him to try to retrieve some of that bullion.
So this treasure is scattered now all over the place. I could be taking a hike in New Mexico or maybe California possibly and run into some of this treasure that your grandparents discovered back in 1937.
Indeed, you could. And I can even give you a clue or a couple of hints about where to look.
Please, let me get my pen. Go ahead. Well, X marks the spot. Go ahead, Terry. Tell me where it's at.
No, Doc had.
No, don't tell anybody.
Doc had about 230 bars on the surface that he had removed, and he had to hide them. And Doc had become paranoid a bit by the time he was murdered, with good cause. But he would count telephone poles, like there would be an overpass in the highway, and he would count a certain number of telephone poles from that overpass, and then every third telephone pole after the 10th one, he would go put 3 gold bars or 10 gold bars and just bury them along the highway. Sometimes he would be driving along one of the ranch roads near the peak, and there would be a horse tank, and he would just go throw a couple bars into the bottom of the horse tank. He was just putting them all over the desert and making little maps for himself about where to go retrieve them, because he couldn't afford to have them in his possession, because now law enforcement was on his trail. He was being tailed by local law enforcement, by the FBI, and the Secret Service. So every time he was stopped for any traffic violation, real or imagined, they would take the gold bars away from him if he had them in his truck. So he had to make sure he didn't have them in his possession.
Now, me, like everyone else listening, will never forget every third telephone pole. So wherever we're at now, I'm just going to, hey, look at that. You know, little did your grandfather know cell phones would take over landlines and no need for telephone poles anymore.
There you go. You can't stay ahead of the future.
Nate, any questions? I'm sure you have a million of them for either Terry or Alex.
Yeah, what kind of technology has been used in the past, or you guys are using to look for that? Like, I know there's like sonar and stuff for rock or ground penetrating sonar. Is there any other kind of things that you guys are using?
Yeah, I'll touch on one of them. Ground radar. That began in 1977. There was a ground radar survey of the mountain, and the guy from Stanford that used that technology on the peak did indeed find a cavern the size and shape Doc described at about the 450 foot depth, just where Doc indicated it would be, below all that collapsed debris in the mountain. Alex then got involved in documenting and participating in what became the largest privately funded seismic survey ever done. Alex, you want to talk about that?
Yeah, so Berkeley got pretty involved, and one of their students ended up being sent out there, and it became very much part of our team, and is part of our team as of today. And he's now a senior geophysicist and won numerous awards for the papers he wrote regarding Victoria Peak, and it launched his career. So yeah, we pick up the phone and it's like, well, what's out there? What's new? And he said, you know, just as of like 2 days ago, he's like, the advancement in GPR, ground penetrating radar, has increased dramatically. There's so much new stuff like LiDAR, where we can cut through vegetation. And what we would be doing when we get back to the peak is try to find that original entrance. That original entrance is not on the mountain. It's a dusty road that has vanished, leading to a area that's closed off with large logs. As Doc described them, when he was on the inside, he could see the logs all leaning and bowing from the weight from the earth on top of them. And he could never figure out what that was on the outside. And he did a bunch of little tricks to try to figure out. Like, for instance, he lit a tire on fire once, a chunk of tire, to see if he could see the smoke coming out of that area. Well, that's low-tech technology. We want to take it to the next level. The seismic work we did was absolutely massive. It was 40 days of straight seismic work where we're doing, either explosions or hammer hits, and that the waves go through the mountain and it's collected by these recorders, many channeled recorders. And of course, that's what John Washburn, who's the PhD geophysicist now, collected that data and was able to 3D map this stuff. And we're talking mid-90s. This was a big deal. And we had support from companies like Sun Microsystems and so on to have the computing power to do that. So you're going to see a lot of this stuff unfold again in the show, it started on the 13th, but like you mentioned, it's every Friday, all the way up to February 17th. So we urge everybody to watch this, because this show is not thin with really cool stuff.
Before, I have a feeling I'm going to get cut off here soon, but I would get beat up if I didn't ask this question. It might sound silly to ask it, but it's very simple. Where did this treasure come from originally?
Best question ever, rarely asked. I have my personal theory, and I'll make a bold theoretical statement if you want. I believe it was the remnants of Aztec treasure that left Mexico City in 1519. It was either part of Montezuma's treasure or an even older Toltec or Aztec treasure. And I believe Victoria Peak may have been the early sacred mountain in the origin stories of the Aztec peoples. And the reason that all of this material was stored in the mountain was because it was this immensely important sacred site to the Aztec peoples. And during the attack by Cortez on Mexico City and Montezuma's empire, much of this treasure was sent north. And the Aztec legend says it was sent back and stored in their original sacred mountain.
Wow. Is there anyone else out there looking for the same treasure that maybe puts a little fear when you're actually there?
Good luck.
Good luck finding it, right?
Well, if it's that easy, anybody would do it. This is about as hard as you could possibly imagine. It's
Yeah.
like 60 miles from the nearest paved road, and it's on the White Sands Missile Range. You know, just to mix it up a little. I mean, it is very difficult to get to.
Do you get a little piece of it, Alex, if you find some? Is that
Well, I've said it before. If I get a little piece of it, I'm just going to donate it to my skeptics.
I'm sure, Terry, your grandkids are like, Grandpa, whatever you need from us, just make sure you don't forget us. We'll be there for you.
I was recently reminded how much a ticket to Disneyland costs.
That's right. All right, gentlemen. The best of luck to both of you. It was a pleasure talking with you and having you on my show. Thank you for all the time to Discovery Plus for allowing us to do this. New episodes of Gold, Lies, and Videotape rolling out weekly. They're there right now on Discovery Plus. If you don't have that app, you've got to get it. It's one of my most favorite apps to have. I cut the cord a while back and I stream everything, and that's one of my go-tos. So, gentlemen, best of luck to you, and hopefully we'll have you on again soon so we can talk about all this gold that you found, all right?
Hey, we'd love to give that report.
Awesome.
Take care. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.